Greetings, everyone, and welcome to our session, White Men's Magic as Slavery, the Politics of Acquisition, Exhibition, and Scholarship. My name is Clint Fluker, and I am the curator of African American collections at Emory University's Stuart A. Rose Library. And before we get started, I would just like to thank a few people who have made this symposium possible. First, I'd like to thank Yolanda Cooper, Carol Henderson, and the rest of the steering committee for their leadership on putting this symposium together. And I'd also like to thank the communications teams, tech teams, volunteers, faculty, staff, and students who have extended their efforts in bringing this event together as well. Now, today I'm grateful for the opportunity to have a conversation with such acclaimed scholars. In this session, we will discuss some of the power dynamics associated with archival collections, exhibitions, and scholarly projects that unduly affect Black lives. And in order to do that, I'm joined by two prominent scholars, Dr. Vincent Wimbush and Dr. Valerie Babb, who will help us engage with the implications of these power dynamics on our campus. Vincent Wimbush is an internationally recognized scholar of religion with almost 40 years of professional experience. He is author and editor of more than 12 books, including White Men's Magic, Scripturalization as Slavery, and scores of articles and essays. His most recent book project is a collection of essays entitled Black Flesh Matters, Essays in Renegade Interpretation. He is founding director of the Institute of Signifying Scriptures and is past president of the Society of Biblical Literature. He has held teaching appointments at Union Seminary, Columbia University, and the Claremont School of Theology and Graduate University in California. His research interests focus on the transdisciplinary study of scriptures as sharp wedge for research and theorizing in the psychopolitics of power, language and discourse, formation, consciousness, and orientation. Dr. Wimbush, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Valerie Babb is the Andrew Mellon Professor of Humanities at Emory University. She holds a joint appointment in the Departments of African American Studies and English. Among her publications are A History of the African American Novel and Whiteness Visible, the Meaning of Whiteness in American Literature and Culture. She has been a scholar in residence at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, and she has lectured extensively in the United States and abroad, including a distinguished W.B. Du Bois lecture at Humboldt University in Berlin. In her research, Professor Babb explores African American literature and culture, the impact of racial whiteness on a multicultural United States, and the mapping of communities in transition. Thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
All right, y'all, so I'm going to just jump right into it. First question is really to set the stage for where we'll go later in the conversation. And to you, Dr. Wimbush, this fall you are curating an exhibit titled The Masquerade, Scripturalizing Modernities through Black Flesh at Pitt's Theological Library. To begin this conversation, could you please provide us with a brief description of the exhibition and why you chose to host it here at Emory?
Well, thank you for the invitation, this opportunity to engage in conversation. Let me go directly to the matter of the exhibition project. I was actually approached by the librarian there, who is a scholar in my field or subfield, as it were. It's not entirely clear whether I still hold the legitimate card, but that's neither here nor there. Aware that I was in the area, he approached me about the possibility of some work in connection with Pitt's Theological Library. And it seemed like an opportunity to continue some creative work along the lines that keeps me on track with the kind of work that I've been doing for the last several years. In fine, the exhibition actually is an attempt to provoke thinking, as I'm given to putting it, about the problem of naturalization in the world, how things become real to us how we make things real and manage that reality. I had for many years connected my own work with the problem of Scripture with this very challenge. I discovered that a compelling way of actually looking at the issue is to see whether and how race, duly in quotation marks, in thick quotation marks, could be seen as clear or open window for analysis and theorizing. And of course, with the fascination with Equiano's storytelling, story project, it was a no-brainer for me to bring all of this together. And so the exhibition called Masquerade is a way of getting a handle on, and as it were, really putting a handle on what I think he's up to and his good offices in allowing us to think about our ongoing challenges in terms of identity making and naturalization challenges in the world. So I'm given to understanding scriptures in more dynamic terms. I'm actually given to using the verb rather than to making it verbal form rather than relaxing with the noun or substantive, falling so easily into essentialisms. So I see scripture as really a kind of fraught abbreviation, shorthand for the kinds of tricks and schemes that we're all involved in. So this takes us far beyond the domain of religion in terms of creating selves and communities, thus scripturalizing modernities through Black flesh, with Equiano as the lens or window, if you will, even as a kind of vector for understanding these kinds of problems in the modern world. It probably is a long way away from what was originally assumed I would be about with this sort of project, but I'm pleased to say that I'm getting the kind of support that's needed to, I think, make this work. And so I hope that it will provoke more conversation. We want to find more conversation partners to continue thinking about these issues. Modern life especially is best understood as masquerade, with all that appertains thereto. And I hope there will be opportunity to talk about some of these issues.
Thank you for that introduction to the exhibition. And I want to dive into an aspect or a theme that comes out of your text, White Men's Magic, and then open it up for a broader discussion. And it's about the concept of scripturalization that you briefly referred to earlier. And in your text, White Men's Magic, you refer to scripturalization as the ideology and power dynamics and social and cultural practices built around texts. And in the book White Men's Magic, you're referring to Equiano's use of the Bible in particular. I was wondering if you could talk briefly about how scripturalization functions in society during the time of Equiano and how he confronts this in his autobiography.
Yeah, the term, I mean, others have no doubt used the term, and, they're welcome to make it work within their theorizing program in any way they like. For me, it is shorthand for A kind of, I think it's best put in terms of a regime whereby things are ordered, power dynamics, classifications, hierarchy. So I'm certainly not the first to recognize this as part of our ongoing reality. What I think the term scripturalizing does for us and brings to the fore the problem of the uses of text that's often forgotten. It's often seen as benign, or what is done in one domain or among one subset of people, mainly scholars or a certain subset of professionals. My point is that it is pervasive. Equiano's storytelling about how the modern is really, or modernities are put together, really shows how pervasive this matter is. So it cannot be relegated to the domain of religion. They're kind of double or triple ironies, and people sort of thinking that it belongs only there. In fact, it comes, when you think of the origins of the term Latin and Greek, we're talking about a phenomenon that's pervasive in society that gets put onto kind of separate domain in religion. That's again a peculiar problem with modernity. So what we're talking about is text not in even narrow terms, but systems of discourse. French theorists and others have argued much about this. I think it's important to use it in deliberate terms so as to explode the tendency to render it benign and of local effect and impact. So it's quite universal, and always has to do with the arrangement of power, or peculiar terms of power dynamics. So let me end with this point about Equiano. He sees this clearly as he positions himself as a kind of stranger in this world, looking, as it were, through a kind of window, or maybe we should say experiencing it as something quite weird. That's where, the term magic is all over his story. And he thinks, as a stranger, that this book reading is really, quite strange. I mean, we're the only ones who think that the way we carry on, because it's so sedimented, we're now fully embedded in it, and are not forced to think about it, but you think this is some weird stuff, what are these people doing? Sitting around, maybe walking, thinking in terms of a book speaking to them, word of God, word of emperor, et cetera, et cetera. Thus, the spin on it as a kind of magic. So it's sort of a fascinating social psychological look at this dynamic. And of course, he cannot miss the point that it helps arrange things and people in the world. So if you want to get in on this, if you want to be successful, if you want to negotiate this world, then you've got to become a scripture reader with scriptural understood in that way in which the likes of Deserto and others, Levi-Strauss talking about the books and writing as form of slavery and so forth. So I use him as a window to again open up this phenomenon at the onset of the modern world, and so continues in our own time in various domains, these are our headlines. So it's hard to sort of miss the ongoing phenomenon and dynamics.
And I'm definitely going to bring us back to that idea of current times, present times in a minute. But I wanted to ask you, Dr. Babb, do you agree with this characterization of Equiano's mastery or approach toward resistance of these power dynamics in the text? And if so, are there other examples or narratives from enslaved people during this period who resisted slavery in this textual manner that we can talk about?
Absolutely. I think the narrative of the enslaved is actually an act of resistance. So to answer your question broadly and perhaps simply,
Yes.
All of the narratives to a certain degree are acts of resistance. I do like the term scripturalization because it really does help us to see the nexus between acquiring the power, emphasis on the word power there, of writing and reading the Bible, and how so many of the enslaved learned to read and write through passages of the Bible and through what the Bible creates as an environment. Coming together for Sabbath schools to study the Bible also became a way that the enslaved could learn to read and write and could learn to frame themselves. And I think that, to me, is the most resistant act here, using writing media to reframe conceptions of the Black self and to give us, at least to a certain degree, interior visions of how that Black self thought about itself. So what we get through the narratives is not completely a vision of some enslaved person telling about their lives. They are certainly mediated by the people that are taking down the story. They are certainly mediated by publication. But once you learn to read carefully, you can find those inner moments in that writing. And I think that is a very resistant act, to be able to voice the self. There are many, many examples about this, examples of this. I think Frederick Douglass's narrative is a great example of someone who realizes the power of written communication to facilitate all manner of change. And he comments on that in his text. One of the things I find very interesting in these narratives is that I don't think we give enough attention to the writers as writers and creators. Equiano was a very savvy writer. He, to me, feigns this kind of innocence towards the written word, feigns a certain worship of the written word because he knew that's what his audience expected. And that, to me, is one of his greatest gifts to us. We can look at him as someone who is an advocate for the enslaved, but we can also look at him as an instance of Black creativity, really setting down its marker that will expand from there over the next 100 years or so. The other thing I think we tend to ignore about Equiano is the way in which he is able to take this piece of discourse that he has created and disseminate it. He is also a master of working the distribution system. If we look at the early editions of his narrative, all of his subscribers are listed in the front. And as we know, at this period, you had to pretty much gather your subscribers to ensure that a publisher would think it was economically viable to print your work. So he has provided that. And in those listings are some of the most prominent white British abolitionists, some of the most prominent female early feminists. So he has chosen his subscribers, I think, very, very specifically as well. His letters to his publisher says, or asks questions specifying the weight of the paper that will be used in publishing this narrative, because he wants it to be an item of prosperity, something that he can something that he can pass down, something that he knows will make sure that the experiences he places in there will be placed in the form that Western society values most, the written form, and therefore that form will be preserved. So I think of his texts literally and figuratively. And in both of those areas, I find it very, very powerful. The last thing I will say too, at least at this moment, is that there was another element of resistance in Equiano's narrative that I think also begins to set a tradition for other Black writers, and that's the use of visual culture. In addition to the portrait that accompanies the narrative, a portrait that shows Equiano dressed in the finest clothes of the period, clearly fitting into the definition of an 18th century gentleman, that humanizes Black Americans. And that portrait becomes an act that accompanies virtually every published narrative of the enslaved for that reason, to show this is someone who is part of this society. This is someone who knows how to use the discourse of this society. This is a valued gentleman or lady who is creating this work. And that use of visual culture translates into the portraiture, but in Equiano, he also gives us a bit of the visual culture that will also start to dominate other texts of 19th century, where he engraves the picture of the the ship that he has saved while he is kind of semi-enslaved on that ship. So the use of imagery, the hiring of illustrators further projects his image as a writing subject.
Thank you. And I think that you've created a nice segue into this next question. And it's really for both of you, but I'd like to start with you, Dr. Babb, on this as well. When there's a scene in White Man's Magic towards the end, the epilogue, I think, where Vincent, you're describing this idea of teaching a class on Equiano, doing these close readings, and the students don't really see what you're seeing. Like, so this conversation about the resistance and the savvy nature of what Equiano is doing is something that does not translate necessarily in that specific instance. And it brings to mind this concept of identity and the way in which we form our identities today. And so as Equiano kind of takes us on this narrative from Africa to the rest of the world, he constructs an identity and he frames a narrative about himself for himself and also for the reader. But his sense of Blackness or a Black identity is different than the way that we would discuss those same terms today. And I'm wondering if you could both discuss, and Dr. Babb, again, starting with you, how our view of Black identity or identities has shifted since Equiano's time.
Yeah, no, I think the plural is important there. Part of what enslavement does is it takes a variety of Black identities and makes them into a quote unquote race. And I will use the same kind of bold quotations as Professor Wimbush has done earlier on in emphasizing the constructed nature of race. So I disagree to a certain degree that his Black identity is different from conceptions of our own, because I think you will find a lot of the values, definitions, and the way that Equiano conceives of Blackness still prevalent in contemporary fiction and film as well. There is a sense that the term Black exists outside of an internal word that would define Black culture, Black interaction. Equiano gives us glimpses of that when he talks about how he felt wearing a suit after he received his emancipation. We get a very, very brief glimpse of that when he talks about going to church in Savannah and encountering Black participants and a Black preacher as well. So I think there are those moments of interior Blackness that will look very, very familiar to Blacks from the 1780s to 2021. And what changes, I think, and what shifts is how these writers use Blackness, how they relate to it, and then how they allow us as readers to relate to it. I think they have a much more complicated relationship with that term, Black identity. And I think we have kind of adopted the language of racial designations in our period. In his period, we see that adoption beginning to be discussed. You know, nobody can quite agree on what Blackness is. Nobody can quite agree on what are the steps for Black progress. But what we are seeing, at least in the discourse, is an agreement.
Dr. Wimbush, any thoughts on this?
There is definitely resistance there. You could see that his whole life represents such. And anybody in that world with Black flesh would clearly have to, you'd either give up, die, kill yourself, go into the water, slit your throat or whatever, or your life is ongoing resistance. So there's no questioning it, the matter at that level. I do want to say we need to be careful seeing either his story or his exploits, some no doubt made up, exaggerated, fictionalized for express purposes, all of it brilliant, whether we can figure out what really happened here or there or not, including, birth. So ongoing resistance, but it's more complicated than that, in that what I mean by scripturalization, he wanted to participate in with all of the mixed politics and results that are part of that. So if we just play for a moment with my notion of what scripturalization represents, he wants in on it, right? And also some contemporaries, some of his contemporaries, and so on, I would want to argue up to the present moment. So it's a complex phenomenon, complex reality. There are resistances, yes, all the time. There's also some collusion. There's memetics, which you talk about the students years ago, will make you cringe. Right? That's all part of it. Yeah. When, for example, he suits himself up as a Christian to be, right? Almost a white man or almost an Englishman, the same thing, and practices the violence of scripturalization against others, right? That sort of thing. Playing Columbus or playing the white evangelical bureaucrat within these colonial settings. So I want to say it's a mixed bag, because that's the honest view or reality that all Black flesh persons finding themselves in this kind of world need to face. But it's not simple resistance, like our reality is not simple resistance. Co-optation, being dominated, just being done in by the reigning ideology. So again, I want to say that it's important to see that already embedded in, there are no such things as sort of just benign texts, right? Already embedded in it is a degree of sort of poison or toxicity, certainly violence and dominance that defines the West, and also a good deal of the rest of the world as an analysis of comparative scriptures around the world would show. So, I'm following theorists who see this as already heavily laden with power dynamics, and Equiano's story does nothing to dissuade me from continuing with that line of theorizing. So he may resist here and there and the like, but he also shows us what he's willing to buy into. And he shows us, how destructive that can be. But that's our reality. And that's why I think he's an important source to continue to mine, to kind of excavate the reality of construction of modernity.
I'm also hearing the phrase, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house.
Exactly.
And for a subject like Equiano, that's the tension he faces. He wants to be a Western man. So part of that, given that ethos, means embodying exactly the violence that you're speaking of.
Yes.
Part of that means embodying the values that are in many ways self-destructive to him, the group that he comes from. So how then do you navigate that in a system that only allows you access to it in the very limited ways that they can? So I think that's why we see these tensions in his narrative.
Sure.
And I'm glad you brought up the passages that are also fictionalized, because many people see that as a drawback. And if you are looking at narrative of the enslaved as historical documents, if you are looking at them solely as fact, that would be the conclusion, that he has somehow, betrayed us by elaborating and by fictionalizing many of these details. But if you look at it as a Black creator creating a form of writing that will garner him some entree into the very literacy-centric Western civilization that is ours, it then becomes proof of his cognitive and creative ability. Not only, wasn't it Jefferson in Notes on the States of Virginia who said, "I've never met a Black person who could do more than relate a fact." Equiano counters that by showing, yes, I can relate facts, but I can also embellish them to make you affected by those facts. I can also create fictional elements to put my story in the constructs that you have said are worthy literature. So we have an introduction in this idyllic African Eden. We have the horror of the Middle Passage. Then we have the redemption at the end. And that's the type of arc that 18th and 19th century readers loved. So Equiano is both a subject arguing against enslavement, advocating against enslavement, but he's also a writer capable of using words, discourse, images, themes for his own purposes. And, I won't judge as a 20th century subject what the purposes of an 18th century Black subject would be, because I can't fully imagine working under those constrictions.
Yeah. We have before us a story that is provocative precisely because it shows the problem, the tightness of positionality, the narrowness of the options. You can, of course, again, simply die in physical terms or psychosocial terms, or figure out how to negotiate the limited space which you're offered during the time. And I want to say that what I wanted to do is to ask the reader to try to come to terms again with what options seem real that are put before someone like Equiano, and what are the ongoing ramifications from having made this choice or this kind of decision to go forward to negotiate the larger world on these sort of terms. And that's what I thought I began to try to do with White Men's Magic, and some subsequent essays and articles. And that's what I think I'm trying to ask of those who will face the exhibition to continue thinking about. So I've drawn out some of his, some famous, some controversial passages that open these things up. And I'm hopeful that we can at some point, if not make final judgments, at least sharpen our sense of self-placement and level some criticism about our own options going forward. So, for example, if I could quickly say this, I've taken as an overall sort of framework for his way of his placement in the world as a kind of stranger, which he wants us as reader to consider him to be. Everything about me was magic, right? I would like for the reader to ask whether that's simply the strange or idiosyncratic nature of the Igbo world he half fictionalizes, or if that's entirely the world that he's placed in, which means including white men's world, and if so, what that means. A nation of dancers, musicians, and so on, mimes, we might add, as a way of explaining how the magic or the masquerade works within the kind of local traditional world that he wants the reader to associate with him at some level, but masquerade at that level nonetheless. White men had some spell or magic almost always related to reading and writing, the facility of such and the performances of such, a kind of special mimetics that he's especially interested in. Third, the book remained silent. This is, of course, the famous talking, I'm given to saying, non-talking book trope that Gates and others have analyzed. I'm focusing on his focus on the book remaining silent as, in fact, the point at which you see the divide, the slavery of the sort that white men wanted to preserve in outward superficial terms, but that he, Equiano, understands this as the real enslavement, right? That in fact, the thing that holds up the white world turns against them, that they're not allowed in. Fourth, with persistence, you may want to say resistance, but again, that's mixed and it's fraught. This passage, the Ethiopian was willing to be saved by Jesus Christ, and you can go on. Now, you may want to understand that in simple, traditional, evangelical Christian terms, I'm reading that as an example of an openness on the part of Equiano and his kind, including some of us, to want fully to negotiate this world. So Christian conversion is actually openness to negotiation of the white Western world, and is fraught with all that has to do with that. That is to say, we find ourselves located in these little cells that we may think, idealizing Black church this and Black church that. That is, of course, an extended mimetics of the sort that Equiano images for himself within the storytelling regime. Lots of good things that have come out of that with the kind of trajectory, historical and ideological, that we could talk about. But there's a lot that has been quite devastating in my point of view, the mixed nature of it all. And then finally, scriptures became an unsealed book. And I mix this with, as a part of the framing of the final section. So he becomes a scripture reader, a wielder of scriptures, making of it a kind of weapon. It's offensive and defensive in its uses. Became an unsealed book. Here, of course, you can read some Morrison and all of this regarding things that paradoxically can never be told. And I use that as a way of at least trying to come to terms with the story itself as a paradox, in the sense that this Equiano wants to tell a story for a specific audience. Professor Babb alluded to this before. This is a white abolitionist order. It's not Black folk in a prayer meeting, right? That's not the audience or his readers.
I push back just a little bit.
Absolutely, sure.
I think that we have to think about these narratives as being written for multiple audiences. So primarily, I think the writers of these narratives have to reach that abolitionist audience for support and networking. But I think all of them embed a little bit of Black cultural marking, so that we know that part of this, at least, has an audience similar to the writer in mind. Harriet Wilson's novel / very autobiographical fiction has an interesting dedication where she writes, "To my colored brethren," and she essentially solicits their support. And she does explicitly in that dedication what I think many of the narratives of the enslaved do somewhat implicitly, and that is to speak to multiple audiences at the same time. And that actually becomes a trait of African-American fiction later on.
That's a good point. I appreciate that.
Small detail.
Just real quickly, I have to kind of, in the interest of time, kind of move us along. We have a couple more questions, and I have to say, y'all are doing great. So thank you.
We're moving, man. Why do you?
We're moving good. I just gotta keep us going toward the path here.
All right.
But I think that what I heard in this last response is exactly where we need to go, which is the idea of this complexity that is negotiated and balanced by Equiano as he's telling this story. As you were saying, Dr. Wimbush, at once there's this sense of persistence, the language you're using, but also this necessity, this desire to be part of. And in the context of doing this, it reminds me of, and this is where I wanted to go with the archives conversation, of a difficult dynamic that happens in higher education, where we, to me, when we think about white men's magic as you described it, and this sense of the power being in the ability to read, literacy, writing, the book. The first thing that comes to mind as a curator, I can't help it, y'all, is that I work at the archive and I'm surrounded by all of these papers and all of these books. And the dynamics that come to mind here are worth noting. And I wanted to kind of just take you all on a journey with me and then get your read. At collecting institutions across the country like Emory, we collect African-American materials, but they're often bought by antiquarian booksellers and private collectors. And for me, this practice reveals that there's both research value in the papers as well as monetary value. And it's attached to Black ephemera, evidence of Black life. And the positions in the antiquarian book trade, the jobs and special collections across the country are overwhelmingly white, the ones that are available. They're held by white people. So as scholars like ourselves who frequent the archive to perform research, I'm wondering, do you see a correlation between the collecting of Black materials in special collections, the use of the materials in this way, and this notion of white magic, white man's magic, or scripturalization, as we're describing here? Because I certainly do, but I'd like to get your read on this as well.
When you ask us to make that comparison, I have to admit butterflies form in my stomach.
Mine too, which is why I led up to it so much.
Right, good. So I won't say that. No, but oh gosh, it's that danger in a sense. This is still a continuation of white man's magic over the preservation of these materials, over whether or not diverse audiences can access these materials. Stanford, Harvard, Yale, they have the budgets to suck all of this up. And I would imagine Emory is not.
Emory as well. Yes.
Either, Emory as well. So I am a little concerned about what the larger implications of that are. And this is why I'm very happy to see people such as yourself, Clint, who I know are aware of these dynamics in a position such as yours. But yes would be the answer to your.
Oh, okay.
I see a connection and it does worry me.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. I'm actually not sure, Fluker, that I understand the question.
Yeah.
You know, clearly with the resources, there's again, there's so many levels of irony here. You know, how do these places get the resources? For, you know, the first thing. So I grew up neighborhood contiguous to Emory. When I was growing up, I don't think they were that interested, you know, in getting these sorts of things. So there's been a lot of social, political dynamics that have gotten Emory, while it's gotten all of this money, around to the point of wanting to collect, shall we say, Black flesh and found, you know, objects and the like. But if you have the resources, my view is help do what you can to preserve materials, number one. But it seems to me that the real issue is about spin or interpretation or the uses of. It doesn't have to be related to the work I'm doing or the white man's magic theoretical framework. But here's the way I would think about this, that you have an opportunity, collective, those of you, you know, working in this context, now to exercise some judgment, which means some power, about how stories are told. So they can no longer be told in terms of lining up objects, including Black bodies, to tell the colonialist story or the empire story. The extent to which Emory and Harvard and Yale have been related to that, then here's a profound moment to undo certain kind of storytelling. I mean, part of the story is, you know, how these folk got rich and got this kind of thing, and how what you have may contribute to rendering far more complex than any of these folk thought about the stories that really need to be told. This one last point on this matter, and you can see that I certainly think, I mean, this is my own reading, my need to read Equiano this way. I think it's not a clear story. It's not a clear story because there's no clear identity. He's trying to find out who he can become in this setting. And there's some flummoxing, there's some falling apart. There's some, again, moments that will make you cringe. They're quite embarrassing. There are flights of the rhetorical and on and on and on. And I would say this about most of the literature there, but don't claim to be authority about them all. This is a kind of lens that I'm bringing to this. Even the binomial nature of, who is the author? He even tells us he's figuring this out. He's this and that. He's Equiano and he's Vassa, with a complex history, all that represents. So there's no clear storytelling. Is there a clear identity anywhere?
Well, I think that's
making it up, right?
But I think that this is where I'm trying to form a connection. And again, it's for you to agree or disagree. But I think that there's a few points of reference that I note as I think it through. One is the kind of fetishization of the object. So we have the materials that we collect with the intention of providing not just research capacity for scholars to come, but also there's a power dynamic that comes in play where once we decide to collect something, it then becomes important, quote unquote. And now researchers come. They're like, if we don't collect it, sometimes it gets lost to history. And it gets this elevated status once it's in an archive, as if this is the story that should be told. But as we're saying, is that the story that should be told? There's many different stories that can be told, that can be described, that can be researched, but it's the power associated with acquiring materials that kind of renders the space in which we have discussions about Black life. In the university. And so for me, that's where I see some of the connection here with this concept, because we're telling a story, and as you're saying, we're not making it up, but it gets a little, it gets tricky, it gets complex.
Yeah, and I think
you're describing it.
Yeah, an archive can give us information and show us the voices that have not been heard before, but an archive can also impose, I would think, a new kind of silencing. So I think that especially today, Black archives have kind of like a double mission. The first being to kind of reconstruct all of the notions, ideas, presumptions that we have dealt with over the period when Blacks become modern subjects. But the second part, I think, too, is to ensure that a kind of invisibility doesn't occur through the use of archives. I'm thinking about the family that sued Harvard for a photograph that they essentially used anytime they were talking about Black history. But that photograph, which was a former slave to the Harvard archive, was someone's grandfather. And the family wanted that acknowledged and also wanted the kind of monetary reward that comes from circulating an image that has been deemed valuable because it is part of an archive. So I think we have a dual concern to make sure that the archive doesn't assume another kind of silencing mode in which they create such a generic story because they're using the same 6 images all the time or the same 3 texts all the time, and create a kind of generic understanding about what the Black past, what past Black subjects actually were. So I do think it's very important to collect, but I think it's important to also contextualize what's being collected and to allow researchers to become more self-aware of what they are finding in the archives, how it got there, and how then they are going to use it in their future information dissemination.
The issues around, again, the object, around the power dynamics that are created, and then also who's doing the buying, who's doing the collecting, and who's doing the trading, and who's doing the appraising is very important to this conversation. When I read White Men's Magic, and as I hear you describe the Masquerade, it is a very, very white male-led space, determining the value, both research-oriented as well as monetary, in evidence of Black life. And also it's an important field to be part of as Black people in one regard, because you want to preserve Black life, but you also have to be aware of the politics of what's happening. And so that's where I wanted to go with that. But I also wanted to follow up on something else you said, Dr. Wimbush, when you were kind of talking about like how you know what you know, like what's there and what's not there. I was thinking about this particularly as you're putting together your exhibition. And I remember we were having conversations about what's in the archive for you to put on the exhibition. So in this context, when you can kind of tell like what an institution values based off of not what's just in the special collections, but also perhaps more so what's not, what we choose not to acquire. So I'm wondering for you, in similar fashion, as you kind of put together the Masquerade exhibition, what research materials would you have liked to have seen? What was missing? What would you like to see in the future?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure I could, right away, list specifics. Let me go back to what I think is a sort of a larger point of principle behind your question. It's the politics of preservation, the canonical politics that are part of museumization and the curatorial arts or sciences, whatever you guys call this. And if you think of Pitt's library, I think it's by no means exceptional or unusual here. You show who you are or who you have been or who you thought you were, through the collection process, the social psychology, what I call the psychopolitics involved in collecting things. So there are lots of wonderful manuscripts that chart the course of European collection of and valuation of manuscripts, and Emory has its share of those. But that only goes to the point, well, we see ourselves as a Protestant Methodist evangelical school participating in the European colonial project. That's what it's about. Now, I hope Emory in general and Candler, not merely just through this project, but this project with others, comes to terms with what that means. So it's been located in Atlanta for a long time, right? Mm. It's not that you just discovered you were in this Black capital, right? Capital of the Black world. So that there are holes aplenty, regarding the history of Black strivings. You can kind of chart the course of Emory's turns in identity or reactions to the politics of the local, regional, the world in general. There are plenty of things, sort of Black folk culture, forms of expressivity, which clearly did not decades ago, certainly a century ago, really register. Now that's hot. That stuff is hot property now. Maybe you can buy your way into it with that endowment. Okay. But, let's be clear about what this says about the history of the institution, that you're part of, this larger initiative with some money, I suppose, among elite universities looking at slavery, is for me really, it's kind of a profound moment, all of these schools are, of course, dripping in that sort of complex history. Is this an effort, finally to come to terms with or tell the truth about? I don't know. I'm not a part of the project. I'm simply saying I can be a witness to history of politics of valuation in terms of collection and preservation when it comes to the domain of theological studies or religious studies. And there are lots of holes because people were otherwise identified. And I'm hopeful that I have enormous respect for Bo Adams' gesture. He probably, again, didn't know what he was in for, but I have enormous respect for what was behind that gesture. And he has even commented on this as an opportunity to come to terms with the kind of holes that are in our collection and what those holes represent. Now, I can't settle all of this, but it was an opportunity for that. And I hope there will be ongoing conversation about all these matters.
And Dr. Babb, it's really the same question from a different perspective. In your own, current book project or past research you've done, either at this archive at Emory or elsewhere, are there particular kinds of materials or collecting areas that you really yearned for that just weren't there? Or as you were doing your research, you were like, you know what, this is missing. And we need to focus on these kinds of stories. Or any that come to mind, and how did it affect your scholarship?
Yeah, I tend to gravitate towards materials that are not traditionally defined as scholarly. The friendship albums, for example, that were put together by 19th century Black women that contained their thoughts, poetry they admired, their watercolors that they would then share among themselves. So I guess I want to see more of that, more of what I would call an expanded archive. Recently, I have been doing work on the quilter Harriet Powers, and only a letter really gives us her voice and what she thought of her life. But those more kinds of immediate, more interior materials, which I know are virtually the most difficult to get, are the ones I would like to see more of. The photographs that I have encountered at many collections, the difficulty is figuring out when they were taken. Who are those people? What location? What region? And I don't know that we can ever solve those kinds of gaps and lacunae, but I think it is important to gather more of those type of materials, more that show the interior voice, the interior thinking of people who are defined as objects. We have enough study of Blackness. I think Saidiya Hartman does a wonderful job in just kind of outlining that and outlining its consequences. But what we don't have are those materials that show us what the studied people were thinking on their own, in their own circles, with their own groups. So I would like to see much more of those kind of firsthand materials into Black interiority occupy archival space. Going back to your earlier question about the larger symposium, I walk across Emory's campus and I see tours with students and parents, and everybody is discussing what a beautiful campus it is, et cetera, et cetera. I'm hoping that part of what the symposium will do is talk about what were the origins of that beauty? How did that beauty come to be? How did this landscape, this built landscape, get formed, and what were the consequences of that? So if students and their larger circles can come around, or I should say, can come away from that symposium, seeing how the United States would be impossible without Black enslavement, then I think that's a definite win.
Well, I think that that's a wonderful way to close this out, about our hopes and dreams for this symposium and the effect it will have on the community. So I just want to thank you both one more time, Dr. Wimbush, Dr. Babb. This has been a great conversation, and I think we went in a lot of different areas, and hopefully we can do it again sometime soon. just not
Thank
on,
you
just
so
not for
much.
the symposium.
This is a pleasure to join both of you.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.